I was standing in my own driveway when a woman in a clipboard and reflective vest walked up, like she owned the street. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask my name. She just said, "You're violating HOA rules. I am calling the police." I laughed and told her calmly, "I am not in your HOA." That's when her face changed. She stepped back, dialed her phone, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "There's a hostile resident refusing compliance." 10 minutes later, 2 squad cars rolled in. Neighbors came outside. Phones were recording. And that's when I realized this wasn't about rules anymore. It was about power. And they had no idea who they were standing against. I was standing in my own driveway, still scrolling through emails on my phone, when a shadow fell across the screen. "Sir," a woman's voice said sharply, "you can park there." I looked up to see her standing way too close for comfort, wearing a bright safety vest and holding a clipboard like it gave her authority over the entire street. Before I could even respond, she launched into a rehearsed speech about HOA rules-approved parking spots, acceptable behavior, and how residents were expected to cooperate without attitude. I listened, confused but calm, and when she finally paused for breath, I said something that should have ended the conversation instantly. "I am not in your HOA." I said it politely, almost casually, assuming that would clear things up. Instead, her eyes narrowed as if I'd just challenged her personally. She tilted her head and smirked, the kind of smile that said she enjoyed this part. "Everyone here is in the HOA." She replied, "And if you keep refusing, I'll call the police." That's when irritation crept in. I repeated myself, slower this time, explaining that my property wasn't part of their association. She didn't ask for proof. She didn't question herself. She simply stepped back, pulled out her phone, and said loudly, "I am calling the cops. There's a man here refusing HOA enforcement and being aggressive." Aggressive. That word changed everything. Neighbors started peeking out from their porches. A garage door halfway down froze in place. Someone across the street lifted their phone, pretending to check messages while clearly recording. I felt my jaw tighten, not out of fear, but disbelief. All of this because I said I wasn't in an HOA. When the police cars arrived, the street felt smaller, tighter, like the air itself was watching. 2 officers stepped out, professional but cautious. The HOA woman immediately walked toward them, talking fast, pointing at me like I was the problem that needed fixing. She described me as uncooperative, disrespectful, and new to the neighborhood, making it sound like she was doing them a favor by handling me early. One officer turned to me and asked for my side. I told him exactly what happened, keeping my voice steady. He asked for my ID and property documents. I handed them over without hesitation, and that's when the energy shifted. He stopped listening to her mid-sentence and actually started reading what I gave him. His posture changed. His expression changed. He looked up at me, then back down at the paperwork, then over at his partner. The HOA woman noticed it too. Her confident stance faltered just a little. She stepped closer, trying to see what the officer was seeing, still clearly convinced she was in control. The officer took a moment longer, then looked back at me with a tone that wasn't accusatory anymore, just curious. And in that moment, standing there with half the neighborhood watching, I realized this whole situation was about to turn in a direction none of them expected. What started as a power trip over parking was seconds away from becoming a lesson they would never forget. The HOA president wasted no time stepping forward once the police arrived, her confidence returning the moment she thought the situation was back in her control. She stood just behind the officers, arms folded, nodding along as if everything unfolding was part of a well-rehearsed routine. This clearly wasn't her first time calling the cops on someone. She spoke with authority, explaining how the association managed the entire neighborhood, how rules were non-negotiable, and how people like me needed to be educated early, so problems didn't spread. She pointed around the street as if the houses themselves backed her up. According to her, every driveway, every sidewalk, every patch of grass fell under HOA jurisdiction. New owners, she said, often tried to claim ignorance, but that excuse didn't work here. The officers listened politely, the way cops do when they're letting someone talk themselves out. She mistook that silence for agreement and leaned in harder, listing violations ID supposedly committed within minutes of arriving. What struck me most wasn't the rules she mentioned, it was the way she talked about people. Residents weren't neighbors. They were units. Homes weren't properties. They were assets. Everything sounded less like a community and more like a territory she was guarding. I could tell she enjoyed the authority. The ability to summon police and make someone stand there explaining themselves in front of an audience. One officer finally asked her a simple question. Whether she had documentation showing my property was part of the association. She waved it off immediately. "It's all on file," she said. "We know which homes belong." He asked, just being difficult. "That assumption we know. So we don't need proof," said everything about how this HOA operated. Power first. Verification later. If ever. As she spoke, I noticed a few neighbors shifting uncomfortably. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked relieved that, for once, the spotlight wasn't on them. It was clear this HOA had a reputation. One built on intimidation and the confidence that no one would ever challenge them. Why would they? Most people just wanted peace, not a fight over technicalities. The officer turned to me again and asked calmly if I had anything to add. I told him I'd recently acquired the property and that it wasn't governed by their HOA. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just stated facts. That seemed to irritate the HOA president more than anger would have. She scoffed and muttered something about rich outsiders, thinking they were above the rules. The officer nodded, then said something that visibly unsettled her. He told her he needed to see the association's boundary records to continue. For the first time since she'd arrived. She hesitated. She fumbled with her clipboard, flipped through papers that suddenly didn't look so official, and tried to change the subject. The certainty she'd walked in with was cracking, and beneath it was a quiet realization setting in that this time, her usual script might not work. The moment the officer finished reviewing my documents, the atmosphere on the street changed in a way that was impossible to miss. He held the papers a second longer than necessary, then slowly turned them so his partner could see. They exchanged a look that didn't need words. It wasn't confusion anymore, it was clarity. The kind that lands hard and all at once. When the officer looked back up, his tone was no longer neutral. It was careful, deliberate, and very precise. He asked the HOA president to step closer and calmly pointed to a specific line on the paperwork. "Do you recognize this entity?" he asked. She leaned in, squinting as if the answer would somehow change if she stared long enough. At first, she shook her head. Then she froze. I watched the color drain from her face as the name finally registered. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The confidence she'd been wearing like armor cracked in real time. The officer spoke again, this time loud enough for everyone to hear. He explained that I wasn't listed as a tenant, a resident, or even a homeowner under the association's control. According to the documents, I was the representative of the company that owned multiple properties within the very HOA she claimed to rule. Not one, not two, several. The same properties that paid dues, followed regulations, and quietly kept the association financially afloat. The street went silent. No whispers, no phones moving. Even the birds seemed to pause. A neighbor across the way lowered their phone, suddenly unsure whether recording this moment was a good idea. The HOA president's clipboard slipped from her hands and hit the pavement with a dull crack. No one moved to help her pick it up. She tried to speak, but the words came out tangled. She said there had to be some mistake. That ownership changes weren't always updated. That she hadn't been informed. The officer cut her off gently but firmly, explaining that the documents were current, verified, and legally binding. There was no misunderstanding here, only assumptions that had just collapsed. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The truth was doing all the work for me. The power dynamic flipped so fast it almost felt unreal. Just minutes earlier, she'd been the one calling the police, confident that authority was on her side. Now she stood there, unsure where to look, While the officers treated me with a level of respect she clearly wasn't used to seeing directed elsewhere. One of the neighbors let out a quiet, shocked laugh before catching themselves. Another shook their head slowly, like they were replaying every HOA notice they'd ever received. The officer finally handed my documents back and told me I was free to go. Then he turned back to the HOA president and reminded her that making false or misleading reports could have consequences. As I stepped back toward my driveway, I realized this wasn't just an embarrassing moment for her. It was a reckoning. The silence wasn't awkward anymore, it was heavy, filled with the understanding that the person they'd tried to intimidate wasn't powerless at all. In fact, I was the one holding the cards. And everyone on that street knew it now. What happened next was almost painful to watch. The same woman who had confidently called the police and spoken over everyone just minutes earlier suddenly couldn't find her footing. Her shoulders slumped, her voice softened, and her words started tripping over each other. She went from authority figure to damage control mode in seconds. The transformation was so abrupt it felt unreal. Like watching someone realize mid-scene that they'd been playing the wrong role the entire time. She started apologizing not once, but repeatedly. First to the officers, then awkwardly toward me. Her sentences rushed and unfinished. She claimed it had all been a misunderstanding. That she was only doing her job. That procedures sometimes got confusing when new ownership was involved. The same rules she'd treated as unbreakable moments ago were now flexible, optional, open to interpretation. It was clear she wasn't sorry for what she'd done, she was sorry she'd done it to the wrong person. One of the officers asked if she wanted to amend her statement. His tone calm but unmistakably firm. The implication hung in the air. This wasn't just an embarrassing situation anymore. It could turn into an official problem if handled poorly. She nodded quickly, insisting she never meant to accuse me of being aggressive and that emotions had escalated unintentionally. The officer made a note anyway. The damage couldn't be undone that easily. Around us, the neighbors reacted in their own quiet ways. Some pretended to be busy, suddenly fascinated by their lawns or mailboxes. Others openly stared, absorbing the rare sight of HOA authority collapsing in public. A few looked almost relieved, like they were watching someone else finally say the things they'd always wanted to but never dared. The HOA president tried to regain control, suggesting everyone move on and forget the incident. She picked up her clipboard with shaking hands, flipped it closed, and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But the illusion was gone. No one was buying it. The officers wrapped up their questions, reminded her again about appropriate use of emergency services, and told her to contact the association's legal counsel if there were further concerns. When the police left, the street felt different, lighter in some ways, but charged in others. The woman lingered for a moment, clearly unsure of her next move. She glanced at me, opened her mouth as if to say something more, then thought better of it. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her footsteps quick and uneven. I stood there for a few seconds after everyone else dispersed, letting the moment settle. This wasn't about revenge or embarrassment. It was about accountability. The HOA had relied on fear and assumption for so long that they'd forgotten what real authority looked like. And now, without raising my voice or making a scene, I'd shown them that their power wasn't absolute. As I headed back toward my house, I could feel eyes following me, not with suspicion anymore, but with curiosity and something close to respect. Whatever came next, one thing was certain: the rules of the game had changed, and the people who once thought they controlled everything were suddenly very aware of it. The following week, I didn't avoid the HOA meeting, I walked straight into it. The room was set up the same way it always was. Folding chairs in neat rows, a long table at the front, and a sense of quiet tension humming beneath polite conversation. When I entered, a few heads turned immediately. Some people recognized me from the incident on the street. Others sensed something was different without knowing exactly why. I took a seat near the front and waited. When the meeting officially began, the HOA president went through the usual agenda items, her voice steady but noticeably restrained. There was none of the sharp confidence I'd seen before. When it came time for homeowner input, I stood up, The room stilled. Every eye locked onto me. I introduced myself not as a resident, not as a troublemaker, but as the legal representative of the company that owned several properties within the association. You could feel the shift ripple through the room. A quiet murmur spread, then died out just as quickly. I explained, calmly and clearly, that my purpose wasn't confrontation. It was transparency. I addressed the incident directly, describing what had happened without exaggeration or emotion. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I simply laid out the facts and explained how that kind of behavior damaged trust, created fear, and exposed the association to serious legal risk. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. This was no longer something they could dismiss as a misunderstanding. It was on record, in front of witnesses, and coming from someone with legitimate standing. I reminded them that property ownership carried rights as well as responsibilities, and that enforcement without verification crossed a line. The room stayed silent, not because people disagreed, but because many of them were hearing this said out loud for the first time. Then something unexpected happened. A homeowner raised their hand and spoke up, sharing a similar experience they never reported. Another followed, then another. What had started as my story quickly became a pattern, and the weight of it settled heavily over the board. The HOA president tried to redirect the conversation, but the momentum was gone. The floor had shifted beneath her feet. By the end of the meeting, changes were proposed. Oversight procedures were discussed. A review of leadership roles was scheduled. It wasn't dramatic or explosive, it was quiet, methodical, and irreversible. Authority was being questioned not out of spite, but necessity. As people filed out, a few stopped to thank me. Not loudly, not publicly, just quick words, relieved expressions. They lived under constant pressure for so long that they forgotten it didn't have to be that way. I left the meeting with no sense of triumph, only clarity. Power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need threats or uniforms or clipboards. Real authority comes from understanding the system better than those who abuse it. The HOA had tried to control me through intimidation. Instead, they exposed their own weakness. And from that day on, every notice, every warning, every rule came with caution, because they knew now assumptions can be dangerous. And the person you try to silence might just be the one who owns the ground you stand on. If you enjoyed this story and want more real-life twists where power flips when you least expect it, make sure you subscribe right now. These stories aren't just about drama, they're about standing your ground, knowing your rights, and watching the truth change everything. New stories like this drop regularly, so hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and don't miss the next one, because the next lesson might be even more shocking.